Yellow microphone test. Yellow microphone test, test. Sounds good.
Red mic check. Rec. Sorry. Red sounds good.
And blue mic check. Also sounds good. set up.
Is this unexpected?
Yeah. They just let me know now. I'm gonna update the projectionist. Like the last time we did four chairs with the 2 tables.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
Do we have tape down here?
grab the water jug and those 2 tables. Water jug can just sit on the podium for now. Sorry, tape on.
Like down
I
to the podium?
haven't
We should
taped.
tape this top one. Or I guess, have you used these since Thursday?
No, I haven't.
Okay, because I hope. Oh, this one went in so easily. This is the same orientation as it was on Thursday. Oh, fuck it. Ground. Yeah, I got you. Almost. Yeah, it's freaking ridiculous. This was the big one.
The tables go on both sides.
So they go in the middle
Okay.
and make like one kind of wider table.
Hey, Julia, Dave, the camera guy, said that we'll move him over this time.
Move over.
Yeah, so instead of being in center stage, close to the podium.
Close to the podium.
So,
Is that easier for the camera? Should they still be facing? Should they be tilted open, or still kind of facing it forwards?
I think we need to see.
Where's the camera? He likes it.
Yeah, I'm gonna let you guys read this. I gotta. Where's the water jug go? And which one?
It can stay right there. This looks like it's totally. Yeah, is it full?
No.
I guess we should fill it. I think Taylor's getting them.
I'll have to grab. And orange mic check. Also sounds good.
ordinarily help them set up their laptops?
No, usually it's
Lizette does it?
yeah.
Oh my god.
I have a PC, so I don't really know Macs well. It's almost always Macs.
Julia, is the AC light on? Today?
I just had whatever it was.
Oh,
I wasn't talking about.
Rodney, well, that's not really my 400 years of resistance and slavery, black public art.
Checks out.
They wanted 8 reserved seats.
8.
Let's see. Are those all larges over there?
I don't know. Mediums and larges all fit.
Okay, that's what I should call that.
How many more?
Uh, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Oh, perfect.
Hey, Doug, we're going to do that laptop check. Thanks so much. Power cord. There's a power outlet here if you need that.
guess I could use my mouse as a pointer too.
We do have a laser pointer, but
Nice to see you again. Nice to meet you again. Coming out. Thank you for inviting me.
because we have the live stream audience and we're recording it,
Okay.
using the mouse makes it so that those audiences can see it as well.
Okay.
If you were to use the laser pointer, the streaming audience nor the later viewing video audience,
Right.
they wouldn't be able to see that.
That makes sense. Yeah, so it's better this way because it's such a big screen. Very sensitive audio. Cap lock.
Is there usually a button that you have to hit, like this one, that connects it to the video out cable?
No, and usually I don't use my laptop for those presentations. Usually I give it to somebody on a flash drive and they put it on the laptop that they use, but I could, maybe it just needs to be booted up. I don't know. What is all this stuff? Is this what it is?
Oh,
Black or unblack slideshow. Maybe that's what that is. There it goes. No, it's something else.
that's
Never mind.
ours.
Let's see. More slide options, black and black.
I guess those are
Slides, maybe?
those are
Oh, that's-
functions of
Oh, no, that's
PowerPoint.
right. Display settings. I've never seen this before. This is interesting. Smart presenter view and slideshow.
Oh, if this was accidentally up there. Oh, looks like we're seeing it now.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay. I
Yeah,
guess
every
that's-
now and then they lose track of which is supposed to be which, and you would be seeing this full screen, and they'd be seeing your
The other
notes and all that.
presentation.
Yeah. That's what
don't
the swap-
forget to say this.
Yeah. Okay, well, terrific. Do you mind just leaving it on this slide
I think it's fine.
until it starts?
Yeah.
Our projectionists will black out the screen, and they have some other pre-show slides to put on. They'll take care of all that.
Okay,
and
so do you want me to put
they'll
like a-
switch it back to this.
Okay. All right, so you guys are going to be showing something else.
That's right,
So-
but you don't have to worry about getting it back to this.
Mm-hmm.
He'll switch it for you. The only
Okay.
thing you have to worry about is moving to the next slide, and the next slide, and the next slide.
Got it.
Is there any settings on here that you can set so it doesn't go to sleep, or turn the password on, or log out, or bring up a screensaver?
Well, after a while, it probably will do that. So I don't know if they would want to have the PowerPoint slideshow just copied on and to start from some other remote point. Other than that, I think that it's going to go into some kind of a sleep mode.
You know, if yours requires you to enter a password upon.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes they don't go into sleep mode if it's
If it's open,
and
it should be
PowerPoint's
okay.
on.
Yeah, I think that should be okay.
Okay. Well, so what we'll probably end up doing, if it does go into sleep mode, when you come up to start your presentation, you might just need to enter your password
Okay.
to get it started again.
No problem.
And then we'll switch away from these slides back over to your laptop.
Okay.
Okay. But he'll be moving back and forth between A&D's slides, and then he'll switch the input back over to your laptop whenever it's time to start.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you. Have a good show.
Thank you.
Good lighting. Yeah. Good podium.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And welcome. My name is Lee Rayford. I'm an associate professor of African American Studies here at UC Berkeley, and with Lauren Croix, associate professor of history of art and field faculty director of the Hearst Museum of Anthropology, I'm co-instructor of LNS 25, Public Art and Belonging. Today's event, Rodney Leon on Black Public Art, Paying Homage to the Ancestors, is the fifth in a series of public lectures and conversations organized as part of this course. In considering public art and belonging, we first recognize that this class takes place on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. We acknowledge and pay respect to Ohlone ancestors, peoples today, and the Ohlone future to come. So this lecture series and the course explores relationships between art and belonging, race and place, history, memory, and the imagining of just futures. We are thrilled to be partnering with UC Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute, formerly the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, and their year-long commemoration of 400 years of resistance to slavery and injustice. I see some familiar faces from our previous talks, and if you hadn't seen one of the previous slides, we've had Paul Farber of Philadelphia's Monument Lab, author, activist, and UC Berkeley alumnus Jeff Chang, Berkeley-based artists Lava Thomas and Mildred Howard, and last week we welcomed SF MoMA curator of contemporary art, Unji Ju. Unfortunately, this Thursday's talk by Sarah Lewis is canceled. Sarah Lewis is a Harvard professor of art history and African American studies and the founder of the Vision and Justice Institute. She's unable to make it, and so I should say, yes, the lecture is canceled, and LNS 25 class is also canceled. So catch up on your work, your reading, get your lives in order. You've been offered a reprieve. But we are, so extra time to work on your exhibition reports. However, our next public lecture, our next public event is Thursday, March 5th at noon, when we welcome Oakland-based artist Sadie Barnett and San Francisco experimental space programmer Dina Beard. In the remainder of the semester, we'll be joined by Oakland-based artists Jesus Barraza and Melanie Cervantes, founders of the graphic arts collective Dignidad Rebelde, chef and James Beard Award winner Bryant Terry, who has a new cookbook, Alvin Ailey dance director Ronnie Favors, Cafe Ohlone co-founders Vincent Medina and Louis Trevino, artist Kanapahanska Luger in collaboration with the Arts Research Center, as well as San Francisco-based dance artist and director Gerald Castle, creative and executive director of SOMARTS Maria Jensen, and playwright Dustin Chin, in collaboration with Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies, who will be mounting Chin's play with the best title, Snowflakes or Rare White People. So in our final public lecture, students will present their own proposals for public art on Berkeley's campus. So of course, an undertaking of this magnitude would not be possible without generous financial, logistical, emotional support. This course, LNS 25, falls under the Division of Letters and Science Big Ideas moniker and is part of the series Thinking Through Art and Design at Berkeley. That series is supported by the Office of Arts Plus Design, a campus initiative under the steady and visionary leadership of Shannon Jackson and the excellent administrative work of Paris Coates and Sumin Se. A+D connects and fortifies the creative life of departments, schools, centers, museums, and student clubs throughout the Berkeley campus and in Bay Area regional collaboration. Arts Plus Design has spearheaded the Berkeley Arts Passport, which offers discount tickets to events on Berkeley students' mobile apps, and I think our class put a run on the SF MoMA ticket, so I apologize if if we ran out of those. A+D also offers course grants in creative pedagogy, co-curates a range of public lecture series, including A+D Mondays, every Monday evening here at BAMFA. All expenses for this course, including our teaching, our graduate student instructors, our students' access to the arts, and this community lecture series is made possible by A+D and by generous philanthropic donation, so we thank them. And we also thank the Othering and Belonging Institute, the sponsor of today's talk by acclaimed architect Rodney Leon. Today's event, as I mentioned, is a collaboration with the Otherness and Belonging Institute and their 400 Years Initiative, which is spearheaded by Dr. Denise Hurd and made possible by program assistance from Takia Franklin, Faculty Research Cluster Coordinator. All of their labor and support and sponsorship not only made Rodney Leon's visit possible, but enabled us to open the Osher Theater today to the public today, which is generally closed on Tuesdays. But I do hope you'll come back because the Rosie Lee Tompkins exhibition of quilts is just is opening tomorrow. So Dr. Hurd, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Denise Hurd shortly. Dr. Hurd is the Institute's third associate director and is a longtime member of the Institute's Diversity and Health Disparities Research Cluster. She's also an associate professor of public health here at UC Berkeley. Her scholarship centers on racialized disparities in health outcomes, spanning topics as varied as images of drugs and violence in rap music, drinking and drug use patterns, social movements, and the impact of corporate targeting and marketing on popular culture among African American youth. In addition to her extensive scholarship in public health, Hurd has also served as Associate Dean at UC Berkeley's School of Public Health for 7 years. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Denise Hurd, who will be facilitating today's event.
Thank you so much, Lee, for that really kind introduction. And we are thrilled to be able to partner with Lee and Lauren and A&D in this course. It's a really special experience, and I'm so happy to and very honored to welcome all of you here to one of our first events of 2020 in our year-long commemoration of 400 years of resistance to slavery and injustice. And I think today's event is especially meaningful and exciting because we have the opportunity to explore and reflect upon unique memorials dedicated to observing the ancestral past of Africans in our nation's history. Ironically, most of the monuments related to African American history in this country have been devoted to uplifting slaveholders and to commemorating the Confederacy. So we have very few monuments examining the past from the perspectives of Africans, either exploring the tragedy of slavery or honoring Africans themselves, despite our extensive and critical contributions to building this nation. So we are really fortunate to feature a program with a really visionary architect who has tapped into the spirit of this past and helped to memorialize it for all time. So the Othering and Belonging Institute, as you know, is we're co-sponsoring this event, and it's part of our Research to Impact series. But before we begin today's program, I'd like to begin thanking our generous co-sponsors who helped make this event possible. First, as I said, we're thankful to Professors Lauren Corse and Lee Rayford, who are hosting this class, and love the idea of collaborating with us to host Mr. Leon's talk. We're also grateful to BAMFA, who's a major co-sponsor of the event, as well as the Department of Arts Plus Design under the direction of Professor Shannon Jackson. And other groups and individuals who made special contributions to this event include the library at UC Berkeley, David Eifler, Rachel Morello-Frosch, the Institute of European Studies, the United Nations Association of the USA, the San Francisco chapter, and the United Nations Association of the East Bay chapter. I'd also like to thank all of the other individuals, including faculty and staff who've helped support our program today. Paris Coates, Asuman Sue at A&D, Takia Franklin, and Larissa Benjamin have been especially helpful with supporting the event today's event. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Tyler Stovall, who will provide a few remarks on the significance of the memorials designed by Mr. Leon from an historical and international perspective. So Tyler Stovall is Distinguished Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's also the Dean of the Humanities Division there. He's also taught at The Ohio State University and UC Berkeley. He recently finished a term as President of the American Historical Association. He specializes in the history of modern and 20th century France. Professor Stovall has written and edited several books on the subject, including Paris Noir, African Americans in the City of Light, and Transnational France, The Modern History of a Universal Nation. He is currently writing a global history of the relationship between freedom and race titled White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, forthcoming from Princeton University Press. So now I'd like to welcome Tyler to the podium.
Thank you, Professor Hurd, and thank you all at Berkeley for putting together this program and for all the work that has been done in terms of commemorating the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first slaves in what was to become the United States. When I was very small, growing up on an all-black street in Ohio, there was a rumor that a house at the end of that street had been a stop on the Underground Railroad. Nobody ever bothered to authenticate that or sort of place it in official knowledge, but the rumor persisted, as do rumors of many other institutions involving Black life and Black history throughout the United States. So when we talk about memorializing this history, when we talk about creating public memorials to it, it is important to remember that this is a history that has in many ways been informally memorialized for many generations. And so what our task is here is to bring together those informal memories, or in many cases those African American memories, with the public record, and with the public record of what not just African American history, but American history in general has been. It is very exciting to have Rodney Leon here to talk about his work. And I wanted to put it in a bit of historical, I'm sorry, I'm a historian, that's what I do, historical context. First of all, I wanted to say a couple remarks about where his work fits into the broader history of blacks and slavery in the city of New York. Many Americans don't even realize that a city like New York was a slave center. For many Americans, slavery was something that was relegated to the South, below the Mason-Dixon line. They are often very surprised to learn that New York City was America's greatest slave port, second only to Charleston, South Carolina, during the antebellum years. That New York City had a population of slaves that was so large that at one point in the early 18th century, something like almost half of the households in New York had at least one black slave. That New York City is a city that has a history of anti-slave riots and the repression of those riots. The Great Rebellion of 1741, for example, which was bloodily repressed, was a slave rebellion. So in exploring the history of slavery in New York, it is important to underscore the fact that this was a major part of the city's history, a major part of the city's economy. One of the first slave markets in the city was actually founded on Wall Street. And one can talk about the relationship between Wall Street as a slave center and Wall Street as a financial center, which of course goes to the impact of slavery in generating the American economy as a whole in the 19th century. Now, in talking about this history, I want to talk about something that's both present and something that's absent. And I realize that I only have a few minutes, so hopefully I'll get to the absent part. But the presence I want to talk about is one of New York's greatest monuments, the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is often associated with the history of immigration in the United States. You can see many, many images of immigrants from Europe coming into New York Harbor, being welcomed by the Statue of Liberty, promising them freedom. And yet there's also a side of the Statue of Liberty's history that deals with the fight against slavery. The Statue of Liberty was originally developed in France and conceived by Edouard de la Boulaye, one of France's first specialists in American studies and a great scholar of the United States, who was also very devoted to the idea of democracy. When he conceived of the idea of the Statue of Liberty, he conceived of it as a statue that would commemorate not immigration, but rather the end of slavery, that America was finally a land of the free. And he wanted to design it in a way that would exemplify this tradition. So, for example, the Statue of Liberty was originally designed, the original design had the Statue of Liberty holding broken chains in her hands. It also had the Statue of Liberty bearing a cap known as the Phrygian cap, which is the ancient Roman symbol for freed slaves. Somehow, these dimensions got lost in translation. The Statue of Liberty that was finally built in New York Harbor, first of all, did not have the Phrygian cap. It does have chains, but they are at the base of the feet of the statue, so that unless you are in a helicopter, you will never see them. And then finally, there was the issue of the torch that the Statue of Liberty carries. The torch, in a sense, was initially supposed to be a symbol of revolution, the flames of revolution that illuminated slave revolts. And yet, precisely because it was such a revolutionary symbol, what you have, that the Statue of Liberty is carrying, is a rather enclosed torch. As de la Boulaye himself said, to illuminate, not to destroy, a symbol of enlightenment rather than revolution. So what you see as the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor represents a certain voyage away from the initial idea of it, and above all, represents the fact that its roots in the anti-slavery movement have been hidden and have been ignored. And this is true to the present day. One of the things the Statue of Liberty does, to go back to the remarks I was making a moment earlier, was to hide the fact that many Americans, many people that came to America, came not as free immigrants but as slaves. It hides the fact that New York was one of America's great slave ports, and that the entry to New York Harbor was, for many people, a situation of bondage rather than liberation. So that's the present I wanted to talk about. I want to also briefly talk about an absence, or absences. Rodney Leon has done wonderful work in terms of trying to memorialize the history of slavery and of African American life in the United States. But it is no criticism of him at all to say that much, much more remains to be done. We have been commemorating this past year the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first slaves in the United States. Last year was also the centennial anniversary of what was known as the Red Summer of 1919. Not only one of the greatest periods of race riots in American history, but also the high point of lynching in the United States. More people, black people, were lynched in 1919 than in any other year in American history before or since. So, where are the memorials to this history? America is starting to develop these memorials. One area I've worked on in particular was the small city of Elaine, Arkansas, which in the end of September 1919 was the site, first of all, of a sharecroppers' strike, a strike by black sharecroppers that turned into a racial massacre. Nobody knows how many black people died in that massacre over about 3 days. The best estimate is at least 250 people, maybe more, like one person has estimated as many as 800. Just last year was the first time that anybody ever created a memorial to that history. Next year, we'll see the centennial anniversary of the race riot of Tulsa, the destruction of what was known as the Black Wall Street, which again saw the massacre of several hundred African Americans. And that was memorialized starting about 10 years ago with the building of a plaque and then what was known as the Tower of Reconciliation. Now, I said I would speak about an absence. The greatest civil insurrection in American history, other than the Civil War itself, were the New York draft riots of 1863, when large white mobs, mostly Irish mobs, protesting against the imposition of the draft, rampaged throughout the city of New York, massacring blacks all over the city, all over Manhattan, in fact, expelling much of the black population from Manhattan. They did things like burn to the ground an orphanage for black youth, and hung and murdered at least 110 African Americans. To this day, to my knowledge, I mean, Rodney Leon may be no different, but there are no public memorials to the draft riots. There is no there have been museum exhibits, but there is no permanent acknowledgement of this history in New York. So have a good visit, Mr. Leon, because you've got a lot of work to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Professor Stovall. They were very interesting and inspiring. And now I'm very pleased and excited to welcome Mr. Rodney Leon, who is our keynote speaker for today's event, to the stage. Mr. Leon is an American architect of Haitian descent and the founder of Rodney Leon Architects. He's the designer of the Ark of Return, the permanent United Nations memorial dedicated to victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade located at UN headquarters in New York City. He also designed the African Burial Ground National Monument in New York, the oldest and largest known excavated burial ground in North America for both free and enslaved Africans, which protects the historic role of slavery played in building New York City. Mr. Leon specializes in urban planning projects with cultural and religious significance for faith-based, cultural, and international development organizations. He has focused his professional efforts and developed expertise in modern culturally contextual design, which uses history and culture to promote a more expansive and inclusive language of contemporary architecture. Current projects include Master Planning and Memorialization for the historic Mount Zion Cemetery in Georgetown, Washington, the Enslaved African Memorial Committee in New Jersey, and the Cultural Museum of African Art in Brooklyn, New York. We became interested in Rodney's work while planning for the 400 Years Commemoration activities, and we were immediately drawn to the very evocative Ark of Return that he designed. Subsequently, I had the chance to be in New York and the opportunity to meet him and also to see the burial ground itself and the amazing work that he's done. And I'm really glad we worked on this for a number of months, that we were able to persuade him to come to California and share his perspective as a part of this important commemoration. We on this campus have been talking for a year about what is it we can do for the campus to do a much better job of portraying our history and the contributions of African Americans to life here at Berkeley. So it means a great deal to have someone that's going to be in our presence who's worked so carefully to provide the respect and homage due our ancestors that are rarely observed on this continent. And we had the opportunity this morning, we did a campus tour looking at, Black spaces on campus, and it was just a really great experience. So, Rodney, if you would please, we'd like to welcome you to the stage. We look forward to your talk.
Thank you, everyone. Well, first, I'd like to thank you very much for having me here at Berkeley. This is only my second trip to the west coast of the United States. Denise and some of the folks who invited me here were kind enough to give me a tour of some of the spaces and places throughout the campus that commemorate the impact and the influence and the contributions of people of African descent historically that have been made here on the campus of Berkeley. And they're these kind of almost like jewels of spaces and places and people that if you weren't given a tour and you were just given the opportunity to just tour Berkeley, you wouldn't be able to necessarily perceive or conceive of the extreme dedication and sacrifice of people that dedicated their lives to education, to liberation, without having a much more of a personal connection and a personal insight, and somebody to be able to actually communicate that history to you. So, some of the places and spaces have exhibits tied to them. Some of them, like even the bookstore that we went by this morning, which is celebrating Black History Month, have even more comprehensive information about Black history than even some of the historic places on the academic campus itself, which was kind of ironic, but at the same time refreshing. And I think that in a lot of ways, these spaces and these places are that are dedicated towards memory, dedicated towards the sacrifices of the people that are, in many cases, no longer with us, are spaces of memorialization, spaces of acknowledgement, spaces of reflection. And because they're not necessarily permanent, as Tyler had said, they might not necessarily last beyond this kind of fleeting moment that we interact with them. So I think that, for myself, as a person of African descent, I've always been interested in delving into and utilizing architecture as a means of expression and a medium of expression to communicate and to understand more about history, about culture, and to create a kind of like a more permanent impact of the history and culture on public space, and to provide people the opportunity to engage and to create, I think, a more inclusive understanding of people's experiences and their contributions to American history. And that goes across a broad spectrum of contributions and experiences, because being born and raised in New York City, I didn't know anything about the African burial ground until I was in graduate school, ironically enough, in university at Yale, at Graduate School of Architecture. And that was the time when the African burial ground was uncovered, I think in about 1993 or so. And I felt that it was, for me, somebody who had prided themselves as a young student in having a knowledge of African American history, diasporan history, to be born and living in a city for most of my life and not knowing about the existence of this burial ground that was right behind City Hall was, for me, a source of shock. So I could only imagine, like most people who think of New York City as being, and it is, this kind of inclusive cosmopolitan city, being the place, a center of slavery and of that type of activity, would be quite a shock to them. But nevertheless, it is part of our collective history, and it's something that people, I believe, especially young people, need to understand and to put perspective on. So what I'd like to do is to present to you some of the thoughts that I've had collected, as well as two of the projects that we've worked on related to these types of monuments. And the first is the African Burial Ground National Monument, which I just mentioned. The second is the monument at the United Nations, which is the monument to transatlantic slave trade and also the victims of slavery. So the first is really coming out of a series of ideas of what I call culturally contextual landscapes. And these culturally contextual landscapes, I believe, are spaces that hopefully allow me to be able to understand the idea of what African American space or black space is. And these are some thoughts and ideas that I've been ruminating about that deal with the idea of how to contextualize American cities and American spaces so that they become more inclusive. And I think that there always was and will be space that was and will be primarily designed and constructed for and reflected of or affected by the social, economic, and political relations called African American. And because of this, I ask myself questions like, what are the processes that have been used to create these spaces or can be used to develop such spaces? How does one construct space that can be identified as African American? An understanding of context is really critical, though I don't mean by what architects traditionally mean by context with that term. I do not mean the conditions that have to do with physical form or physical space. I'm not really referring to physical environment necessarily, or the processes of mapping the empirical relationships that exist in a physical environment. But rather, I'm talking about a more dematerialized context. I mean the less tangible elements of culture and history and society, like arts, economics, religion. These are unseen, but nevertheless present aspects of architecture, which can be used, I believe, as tools to generate architectural narratives specifically by and for people of African American descent to create African American spaces. Cultural context as it pertains to the African American has often been underemphasized and ignored. And I think there are two primary reasons for this. First, as an act of self-preservation on the part of African Americans, concealing one's context can ensure one's safety. Hence, you'll be able to survive the Tulsa race riots. Secondly, African American cultural context, more obviously, I believe, has been historically marginalized, most likely by those who are wishing to maintain power through the institutions of oppression and control. As students and as architects and as citizens, if we are ignorant of these hidden contexts, that we call African American, we risk obscuring or neglecting the potential for African American space. And like African American space, African American history has also been muted and dematerialized. Cultural contextuality, that is, attention paid to context in the fullest sense, which re-emphasizes, reconstructs, and rematerializes, is necessary today. African American space, like African American history, must not be seen as a separate from American or architectural history at large. It is a fundamental part of our collective consciousness, and as well as our identity as Americans. In fact, African American space is inherently American. And in order for African American space to be considered, African American history and culture must be first acknowledged and understood. So rematerializing African American context in architectural form, in my sense, reveals that which has been concealed. The power of architecture is to return to us our context. If it cannot return what was stolen, it can possibly establish the memory of that loss and pay tribute to the people's resilience. And only by identifying and recognizing this existence can African American space emerge from the limited and restrictive psychological confines of slavery and racism. The African American cultural experience is one that is unique to and is defined by the American experience. Africans were stolen to make America, and as a result, African Americans are, in every way, essential to what we name American. Stolen labor, skills, and knowledge inform the building of everything from southern slave plantations to the large cities of the East Coast. Some manifestations and evolutions of African American culture are familiar to mainstream American culture. Consider the African American contributions to music, from Negro spirituals to gospel, jazz, rhythm and blues, rock and roll, soul, funk, house, and hip hop. Cultural anthropologists and historians have since illustrated the connections between these genres and the African oral tradition of call and response. This demonstrates how rich histories can be referenced and cultural traditions reconfigured to operate under a set of conditions. Just as the African American context, beginning with the oral tradition, has been at the heart of American music, it can provide, like other cultural traditions, a limitless material for constructing the narratives of Black space within the spheres of memorialization, design, and architecture. The impact of slavery on American society is often considered, but its consequential impact on society as a whole does not receive the same type of attention as it should. This lack of acknowledgement is a blatant disavowal of the significant role that Americans of African descent have had in building the United States and in the Western Hemisphere. My perspective is formed by my context as an African American of Haitian descent. Haiti was the first independent Black republic in the Western Hemisphere and was freed and founded by formerly enslaved people who banded together in armies to defeat the British, the French, and Spanish forces. The slide that I'm showing you now, the Citadelle La Ferrière, was conceived and constructed after Haitian independence in 1804 and was the largest in a series of fortifications built by Haitians to defend their country from attacks by French and other European forces. It is still one of the largest fortifications in the Western Hemisphere. Located at the top of a mountain in northern Haiti, the citadel allowed 19th century Haitians a vantage point over the adjoining valleys and the Atlantic Ocean. The French invasion that the citadel was built to deter never came, but the enemies of freedom and liberty found other ways to punish the nation through repayment plans, trade embargoes, and political interference. The lingering results of these long-term interventions have made Haiti one of the poorest countries in the world today. However, I would say one of the richest culturally. The Citadel remains a beacon and a significant cultural icon, a work of architecture that monumentalizes the ongoing project of liberation as it simultaneously memorializes those who suffered and those who continue to suffer in the aftermath of slavery. My identity as an African American of Haitian descent connects me also to the context of the Citadelle La Ferrière, and in turn, the Citadel brings us to the greater context of African American and American history. Consider this narrative of liberation. The Haitian Army's defeat of France precipitated the sale of the Louisiana territories to the United States. the United States was able to acquire 828,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi River in a single purchase. Without the abolition of slavery in Haiti and without the successful war for Haitian independence, France would not have sold the Louisiana territories to the United States, which therefore would likely not resemble the nation that we all know as it exists today. Without this sequence of events that instantly doubled the country's area, would the project of Western expansion have occurred at all? Also consider this brief narrative. In 1790, Jean-Baptiste Dussab, a Haitian explorer, became the first permanent resident and founder of what is today the city of Chicago. The city was founded by a black man from Haiti, and he is honored by a monument commemorating this contribution. And this is less than 100 years, well, actually not that many years after Haitian independence. I comment upon these sometimes underemphasized and often concealed histories because the process of revealing informs my work by helping to provide more inclusive historical narratives to society's knowledge and experiences. In my academic and professional practice, I strive to understand culture and history as a basis of modern identity and seek to create formal architectural language reflecting this condition. Most of us fail to comprehend the degrees to which our own lives have been influenced and are connected to the legacy of people of African descent, as well as a confluence of others. My identity is constructed from a combination of American, Haitian, and African components, as well as European and perhaps Native components. The journey I have taken in my adult life through my work reflects the process of attempting to understand how these multiple cultural elements form the basis of my own identity, and in doing so, acknowledge the role that the transatlantic slave trade played as a powerful catalyst in its evolution. While a student in architecture school, I began to be interested in the possibility of establishing contemporary expressions of African culture through architecture. Soon after graduation, I took the opportunity to spend a few months to live and work in the Ivory Coast in West Africa. This experience helped me to more specifically synthesize my contemporary ideas relating to African-inspired cultural and spiritual form. It was upon my return to the United States that I was able to apply some of these concepts as a designer for the African Burial Ground Memorial, and later for the Ark of Return. One of the biggest challenges in developing a design for a memorial project is to understand and to interpret program requirements established by multiple stakeholders. The functional requirements are often complex and contradictory. I feel as a designer, though, it is important to expand upon the existing program and establish a set of objectives, expectations, and criteria that the project must meet in order to be considered successful prior to even putting a pencil to paper. Some of these primary objectives are as follows. Education, and I would state this almost as a kind of like a manifesto. A memorial must first communicate and educate. I maintain that architecture of memorialization must communicate and educate as a timeless teacher. The memorial communicates history for generations to come. As one engages both visually and experientially, one must become enlightened to the sacred cultural and historical significance of an event or an individual, precipitating the memorial's creation through the medium of space, form, language, symbol, and ritual. The memorial must be a medium of communication and education for all people of all ages, classes, genders, religions, nationalities, and ethnicities. A memorial must also have a significant and powerful urban presence. A memorial must be seen at a distance and stand out to establish itself visually and formally within the fabric of its environment. The memorial must be able to accommodate large groups of people as well as intimate scale spaces for personal reflection and contemplation in order to function at the scale of the individual and function at the scale of the city. We also believe that a memorial's design must be what we call culturally contextual. By that term, I mean the language, form, and function and ritual behind the elements constituting the memorial should be inspired and or derived from some cultural or historic precedent. Historical precedent for our forms are often influenced by both traditional and monumental African architectural typology. The desire is not to reinvent the past forms, but to learn from them so that they may be synthesized into a unique contemporary architectural expression. A memorial must also utilize spiritually and culturally recognizable iconography. A memorial must be seen and engage the language of the icon as an image that identifies the site and the memorial universally in people's minds and establishes the memorial as a monument that carries and creates meaning. A memorial site must be designed as a sacred site and a memorial as a sacred object within that site. The memorial site must be designed as a sacred space, with the memorial itself within that space a sacred object that carries memory and culture. Memory and culture are inherently loaded with issues related to death, loss, triumph, and tragedy that can be both sensitive to the individual in different ways. These memories, as well as people that created them, sustained them, must be celebrated. The site must be a place of pilgrimage and the monument a place of reflection. A memorial exists typically within a public space and must be designed as a place of collective acknowledgement and reflection. The monument must speak to all people and to our shared experiences. Its beauty, meaning, and power must be expressed in a manner that transcends difference and brings people together. It must be universal. It must be seen as an opportunity to communicate historical and spiritual values to people from all over the world through a common language. A memorial must also be interactive and participatory. The monument must offer visitors active participation in a ritual of physical interaction. The visitor's senses must be engaged through the use of multiple mediums of expression and encourage people to interact physically within the space in a meaningful way. We want to invert the classical idea of the monument as being something to stand away from and look up at or look at us. Through the element of ritual, visitors can become active participants through verbal and physical action and movement. One must be induced to see, touch, and even listen to the memorial. The memorial must not be static as an object, but be a living and breathing space. For the African Burial Ground Memorial, it was in May of 1991 that the United States General Services Administration was preparing to build a federal office tower at Broadway between Duane and Reed Street, that the first human remains from the 18th century African burial ground were accidentally uncovered. Construction was subsequently halted, and the resulting archaeological excavation unearthed more than 400 skeletal remains. I'm going to go back to that image. Those remains were of men, women, and children, along with hundreds of burial artifacts. Archaeological research determined that approximately 60% of the remains were of adults and 40% were of children. Life expectancy of the adults was on average not beyond their mid-30s. So this is an image of one of the remains that was uncovered by the archaeologists while they were excavating the burial ground site. The discovery of the African burial ground called into question conventional history that slavery in the United States was primarily a Southern institution. The presence of the burial ground brings to light the fact that New York City was not only a major slave port in the 1700s, but had the second largest enslaved population in colonial America during the 18th century. During that time, the African descendants comprised between 14 and 21% or more of the city's population. More importantly, the burial ground's discovery, again, highlighted specifically the role that enslaved laborers, free farmers, and freed individuals of African descent played in the building and prosperity of New York City. The African burial ground is widely considered to be one of America's most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century, and in 1983, the burial ground was designated a National Historic Landmark. This is a fragment of a map that can be found in the Library of Congress called the Van Bursum or the Marshalk's map, which is a very weird name. But what it's showing is, if you can kind of make this out, it says Negroes Burial Ground. This jagged line is a fence line that runs east and west, and it's essentially at the location of what would now be considered Duane Street, and this edge here would be considered like Broadway. This area where the Commons is essentially where today's City Hall exists, and at the time, this line just north of City Hall around Chambers Street was the northernmost boundary of New York City. So at that time, New York City pretty much stopped right behind City Hall at Chambers Street. So this fence line, which is part of the Van Borsen plot, everything north of that fence line was essentially a sloping, swampy kind of like wilderness. This indicates a fresh pond that was there, and just to the west of that pond was what they call Potter's Hill. And when the Dutch lost New York to the British no longer allowed people of African descent to bury their dead within the boundaries of the city. So just north of the boundary essentially became the place where the Negroes' burial ground, the African burial ground as we know it today, allowed that to spring up. Over time, that New York expanded northward. The swamp and the pond were drained. The hill was raised. This area was filled over and covered over. And then New York essentially expanded northward from there. We commemorated the African burial ground with an ancestral libation chamber. Through 7 elements, the ancestral chamber served to physically, spiritually, and ritualistically define the location where the historic reinterment of remains and artifacts of 419 Africans has taken place. It also serves to acknowledge the site as a sacred place where an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 African descendants are currently buried. There are 7 elements that comprise the African burial ground design. The first is the Wall of Remembrance. And on the north wall, as you walk along that area of Duane Street, you will see inscribed the phrases, "For all those who were lost, for all those who were stolen, for all those who were left behind, and for all those who are not forgotten." This is an image of that wall of remembrance. And to the left of that is an image of the Adinkra symbol from the West African people, which is called the Sankofa symbol. That Sankofa symbol was found on one of the archaeological remains on one of the bodies that was uncovered. So they believe that that person or some of the people came from that part of West Africa where the Adinkra originated from. We would know that area right now to be Ghana and the Ivory Coast, essentially. So that meaning behind that symbol is to look back to the past in order to understand and move forward into the future. So it became a kind of like a symbol which was reflective of the project as a whole in terms of like its meaning and significance. The second element is the ancestral reinterment zone. In October of 2003, 7 large sarcophagi, wooden boxes containing the remains of exhumed African descendants, were ceremonially reinterred on this part of the site. The zone of reinterment is marked by 7 large burial mounds, identifying the location of the descendants originally uncovered at the site. You can see these large mounds here where the reinterment of the 419 archaeological remains that were uncovered were reinterred. And those mounds are located on the east-west axis on the site. If you were to look at a plan of the exhumed grave sites at the time, all of the bodies were laid on an east-west or orthogonal condition with the heads to the west and the feet pointing to the east. So we created these mounds in the same orientation along that 18th century orientation in kind of like a skew to the 20th century street grid as a homage to how the bodies were originally discovered. The next element is the memorial wall. The memorial wall serves to visually clarify the scale of the actual burial ground versus the scale of the memorial site. Because the original boundaries of the African burial ground extend significantly beyond the boundaries of the memorial site itself. Over time, the original boundaries have been lost, and in order to communicate that fact, we inscribed a map on the southern wall of the ancestral chamber. The map on this wall serves to clarify the extent of the burial ground's actual size through Lower Manhattan. So, in this image, you can see there's a little, I'm going to have to go back, sorry. You can see there's a little rectangle. That's the corner where the memorial site is located. That's about a 1/4 acre. And you can see the 20th century grid. This is Broadway. City Hall's right about here. This is Foley Square, where the major courthouses are. This sandblasted area shows you the actual scale of the burial ground below, about 20 feet below ground, that extends from Broadway all the way to Foley Square. So it's about 16 times the size of what you see when you go to the site. The ancestral chamber is this form that we use to transition between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. The ancestral chamber is a spiritual form that rises out of the ground about 20 feet above street level. This height represents the distance down one would have to excavate in order to reach the level of the original burial ground. The form of the ancestral chamber is a synthesis of both traditional and monumental African archetypes, representing a soaring African spirit, embracing and comforting all those who enter. Their collective energy and spirit thrust upwards out of the ground towards heaven, reclaiming their honor and place in history. These ancestral Africans were taken from their homeland through a door of no return. These are some sketches of some of the concepts of the ancestral chamber. The sketch up right now shows that the chamber essentially is transitioning between an upper and a lower level, and that you pass through the chamber in order to go from a more public space, a more secular space, and then you go down through it into a more private space. The ancestral chamber is a vessel that serves as to take us back to an original place where we all began. These ancestral Africans were taken from their homeland through the door of no return. One enters the ancestral chamber through a door of return. It provides a sacred space for individual contemplation, reflection, meditation, prayer, and healing. This is an image of myself at a place called Gorée Island in Senegal. And the door there is the door of no return, which is a door where people were taken from slave ships, never to be seen again. So we created in the chamber a concept of a door of return as an inflection point and a place where people can understand and acknowledge that part of the history, but actually create kind of like an inversion and the possibility of return psychologically and spiritually going back to a place where we all began. The idea is about not just commemoration of the tragedy, but about the possibilities for hope and healing. So here are some images of the actual door of return. The symbol above the door is another Adinkra symbol. That's the Adinkra symbol for hope. The idea of passing through that chamber is supposed to also acknowledge the idea of the middle passage. The space is a kind of a dark space. It's a space that but also has the possibility for light and for transition to occur and passage to occur. So there's a triangular oculus and there's a triangular entrance that points you to the court when you pass through it. So the idea is going from a kind of darkness into light as a transition space, from the secular to the sacred. The circle of the diaspora constitutes a series of signs, symbols, and images engraved around a perimeter wall encircling a libation court. These symbols come from different areas and cultures throughout the world, especially Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Symbolic meaning is described below the images inscribed on the wall. As one moves around or circumambulates around the perimeter of the court and spirals down the processional ramp, these symbols present themselves as a reminder of the complexity and diversity of African culture's manifestation in the Western Hemisphere. The spiral processional ramp descends 4 feet down below street level, thereby bringing visitors physically and spiritually closer to the ancestors' original interment level. The ramp and stair serves as bridges between living and spiritual realms. They symbolize the process of transcendence from physical to spiritual, and passage from profane to sacred. The ancestral libation court is situated on axis with the ancestral chamber. It provides a physical and psychological separation from the public activity surrounding the environment. Inscribed on the surface of the libation court is a map suggestive of the migration of culture from Africa to North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. The libation court is a communal gathering space where small to medium-scale public cultural ceremonies can occur. This is a spiritual space where reconsecration of the African burial ground site will continually take place during libation and other ceremonial rituals. The ritual of libation is an act which will serve as an offering and an acknowledgement linking past, present, and future generations in the spirit of Sankofa. This image is an interesting image for me because I've been to the site on numerous occasions and have seen different groups of people come to the site and pay homage to their ancestors through different spiritual traditions. In this particular instance, it's a group of women who have come here as part of a Shinto shrine and have intuitively understood how to embrace this space and occupy this space and utilize this space according to their own spiritual traditions. And I believe that this is the kind of thing, not just for of the idea of universalism, but the idea that these spaces and these places and these monuments need people's connections and interactions and rituals and cultural ceremonies for them to be living and breathing spaces and active spaces. This slide shows an intersection, I find it interesting, of the different elements together. There's a young woman who's looking at some of the symbols that are engraved in the circle of the diaspora at the bottom of the spiral processional ramp. You can see the intersection of the court, the chamber, the memorial wall, and the wall of remembrance, and in the distance, the mounds and the trees behind that grove of reinterment. I'll close with the Ark of Return, permanent memorial to the United Nations to honor the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Acknowledging the tragedy, considering the legacy lest we forget, are three distinct phrases, individually and collectively, that were established as the theme for the competition and formed the inspiration for the design for our memorial in honor of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, entitled The Ark of Return. The Ark of Return is organized around a three-part theme. The primary formal element used is the triangle, which references the triangular slave trade. The triangles come together collectively to form a shape reminiscent of a vessel or a ship. This is meant to acknowledge the fact that it was physical ships that transported the millions of African people to the Western Hemisphere during the Middle Passage. These are sketches of some of those concepts of the ship. So through the Ark of Return, we propose a spiritual vessel and a sacred space that psychologically and spiritually is meant to transport humanity back to a place where acknowledgement, reflection, and healing can take place. Through the memorial's three-part organization, visitors are meant to pass through the Ark of Return to experience these three elements located within the interior of this space. These elements encourage people to acknowledge the tragedy, consider the legacy lest we forget. And upon one's arrival in the plaza, just to the north of the General Assembly building, one will be greeted by an image of a glowing white marble form, prominently placed on central axis with the plaza. A triangular window at the side of the monument draws one towards it. On axis with the opening, prominently featured on the interior wall, is the outline of the African continent. As one draws near and looks through, we see that the relief of Africa is part of the first element, a three-dimensional map inscribed on the interior surface of the memorial. This map graphically depicts the global scale, complexity, and impact of the triangular slave trade in acknowledgement of the tragedy. One thing you can't see very well in the image is that it's meant to be interactive, that you can touch it. there's 66 locations that we were able to research where people were physically taken away to different parts of the world that are inscribed on that map. The African people transported under extreme conditions during the Middle Passage. Visitors are provided the opportunity to sincerely consider that legacy upon slavery's impact upon those people's lives. The second element is a trinity form. And that trinity form, you can see like the image of a body with an outstretched hand that kind of draws you into the space. This is an image of the entry point into that space, and of the trinity form itself lying within a triangular niche. We call it the trinity form because it is meant to be in honor of the people, the men, women, and children that died during the triangular slave trade. So this trinity form itself is almost like the spirit of those people that died being brought back to the African continent. You can see the outstretched hand. It's constructed of Zimbabwe black granite, and the robe is handcrafted from a white marble from Italy in Carrara. The third element is a triangular reflecting pool or font, which introduces water in a meditative, ritualistic, and spiritual manner. Visitors are invited to pour libations or say a prayer in the memory of the millions of souls that were lost, lest we forget this monumental and historic tragedy. In front of that, as you pass through, it's kind of hard to see here, but the names of, let me see if I can get this, right about here on the lower area, the names of the people, the locations, I should say, of the people, where the people were taken from is inscribed in the front. In closing, I've come to the realization and believe that the process of memorialization is in itself, for me, a sacred act. To approach it as anything less becomes essentially a spiritual transgression. We are all entrusted with the responsibility to interpret the contribution to history of our ancestors for future generations, thereby acknowledging their humanity in a way that was not possible when they were alive. This task has become even more difficult when we do not specifically know the details about the names or the lives of the people that we memorialize. For that reason, I believe an appropriate response requires the incorporation of multiple mediums of communication into the design in order to achieve our objectives. This allows us to see memorial design as being constituted of more than just purely physical form and space, but also about ritual, memory, and what we all hold most sacred. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodney. That was marvelous. Now we're going to invite our faculty up to have a very brief, Rodney, you want to stay up? A very brief Q&A with the faculty, Professor Stovall, Rayford, and Coyce. Would you like to come up and just have a seat? Yes, come on up. And I'll let you know. Yeah, you may sit.
Thank you so much. It's really a gift and an honor to be able to kind of walk through both of those memorials with you, also as a New Yorker, so I really appreciate that. So we have, in LNS 25, we generally have 2 questions that we begin and end every public speaker event with, and I'm hoping that you can take those on for us. I think the first you've answered quite beautifully, which is for us is how do you define public art? and why does it continue to matter? And then secondly, our students will be designing their own proposals for, or their own public monuments, works of public art for this campus as their final project. And so we ask our guests to consider what kinds of public art they would like to see.
Okay, great. Everybody can hear me? I think that just even visiting this morning around Berkeley's campus and, being from the East Coast and understanding the context of free speech and Berkeley's place in the history of free speech and liberation and struggle politically, both in the past, historically, but also to a large extent, I believe, currently in the future, that there's so much of a reservoir of history and culture here that can be mined for memorialization, interpretation, communication, and manifesting itself on this campus. I think that, there's no lack of resources available. For me, that history and that culture is a resource and a materiality to work with. So I think that, it's almost like Booker T. Washington says, cast your bucket down where you are. You can do, honestly, a lot worse than Berkeley as a resource for memorialization from the struggles of free speech to the women's rights struggles, to struggles of migrants. We saw so many different, even in the short time that I was here, places and spaces that I think, deserved even more reflection, opportunities for reflection that essentially are like really an extension of the history of this place, really. And in a lot of ways, revealing that even in a more powerful way, I think, sounds like an exciting opportunity for a studio or for a class.
Thank you. Do you have a question? I don't want to. I can ask one too. I'll take it first. I am particularly struck, thank you so much for your talk, and I'm particularly struck, I hadn't seen the images so big before, and I haven't encountered any of them in real life yet, although I'm hopeful that I will. I was so struck by just how beautiful they are, and when you were talking, especially at the end, about the different kinds of stone that you're using, and the way that they're crafted, it helped me think more about the kind of spirituality and sacredness that you offer. And I was wondering if you could think more with us about the role that beauty plays in your work, especially thinking through histories that are so hard and so difficult.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting comment and observation. I think that you don't necessarily equate like a lot of these tragic histories with like something beautiful. But part of, honestly, what it is that I'm looking for when we're going through this process is for us to acknowledge the tragedy, but at the same time find an opportunity to draw people in for an opportunity to learn and to heal. It's often very difficult to find that balance, and that's why I think the first contextual element of education is really critical, because utilizing the place, like let's say the burial ground or the Ark, as a mechanism for developing a narrative for teaching about our colonial and the legacy of slavery, I think is one of the most important things I think I wanted to achieve. And for many teachers, especially let's say primary school teachers, and for people who are young students of color and also people who aren't, there's an aspect of like fear and shame that we have to be able to overcome. And I think that if you create a place or a space that has a focus on healing and a place of beauty, it allows there to become more of an opportunity for us to be able to collectively learn and to move beyond the tragedy and the sorrow and the hate and the anger and the fear, and then get to a point where we can get to the point of healing. So that's where I think beauty plays that role, to kind of like draw people in.
I just wanted to ask a question that's kind of related. I was impressed by not only the beauty but the dignity of the memorials and of the figure, especially on the Ark of Return, because some of the other memorials around slavery just do not express that kind of dignity and respect to the person.
Yeah, I think that also there's these kind of complex and contradictory needs that have to be met when you have a part of the first question also had to do with, like, public space. When you're dealing with a public space that has to deal with not just these kind of issues, but let's say this is a cemetery, right? You have to deal with the fact that it's a sacred place. How do you make a space public and accessible, but at the same time have people respect it in a particular way? So you have to create, I think, a balance of respect through a kind of like exuding a kind of like a sense of sacredness. And you also need to provide an opportunity for people to be able to reflect individually, but also for groups of people to be able to teach or congregate for spiritual or educational purposes. And then there are also larger gatherings that need to take place also, let's say annual ceremonies. So you might have like literally like thousands of people congregating around a site like that for, in October they do these kind of like annual reinterment ceremony events. So, there's this kind of like tricky balance for contemporary spaces like these in order to be able to work and operate on these kind of multiple levels simultaneously. And for me, you can achieve that through that's why you need multiple elements dealing with multiple issues. It's not necessarily kind of like a singular kind of a issue. Like a classical idea of a monument, if you take like a Confederate monument, it's a very kind of like a thing coming from like a kind of classical history, where you have an individual on a pedestal, you're looking up at them, you're meant to be in awe of them, you're meant to look at them but not get too close now, don't touch this person, because this person is way above who we are, right? Where, that's the experience. And it's also kind of like, if you think about a statue, there's only really kind of like a front, right? And when you look at the back, it's sort of like you're not really meant to interact with the back or even kind of like the side. It's meant to be this kind of like a psychological relationship that's established, like, a person is here and then you're down there, as opposed to what I call kind of like a more fluid, interactive kind of relationship, which is, we're both sort of like, they were a person, so we can maybe connect at a kind of like a personal level, right? And maybe, it's not about this, like, the physical manifestation of the form of the person, but really the spirit of what that person represents. So maybe there's a kind of like a physical presence there, or maybe it's more of an abstraction about what they represent. So that when you're experiencing this space, you're experiencing this space in a much more interactive way, where, your experience is more of a kind of a physical connection with the memorial, or with the space, with the person, with the object. And that's why I believe you need to have that kind of like flexibility and multiplicity. And you have to understand that you're dealing with, people of all ages and different cultures in public spaces. So you're not just dealing with individuals, groups, and let's say large gatherings. You're dealing with, like, children, people with disabilities, both physically and visually. So people who have visual impairments can touch and still have an interaction. People with, impairments that they can have, like, say, you can hear like the waterfall, if you can't see, And I think that multiplicity makes it much more accessible. And to me, that's much more about what a contemporary public space should be like. It needs to be as accessible and as complex and provide as much opportunity as possible for people to interact with it on different levels, and to take from that experience something that they can, hold on to, and hopefully that way becomes more transformative. And it also meets people in a communicative way at their level, in through mechanisms that they can engage in, or that they find to be much more, I think, therapeutic, when they come to a space. So you can see, like, some people like to sit on the bench by the memorial wall, which is quiet. Some people like to be down the lower level of the court. Some people like to be within the chamber. Some people like to be more towards the landscaping. So, I think that talks about multiplicity and complexity versus heterogeneity and singularity, right? It talks about inclusivity as opposed to these kind of barriers, right? Walls and these other kind of things that divide us, right? So that's part of like the concept.
Again, thank you. I wanted to ask about the whole way in which you approach the idea of return or non-return. You have these parallel sites, one of which is called the Door of No Return, one of which is called the Ark of Return. What did it mean to you to deal with this concept of return in this case? And if you talk about return, okay, if you talk about return, okay, return to what and who's returning?
That's a good question. In the Door of Return that we implemented in the African Burial Ground, and in the Ark of Return, which was actually the space itself, we're still talking about an acknowledgement that the transatlantic slave trade really had this kind of significant, I say, impact on people in a that transcended, I would say, even kind of like the time that it occurred. Like, we're still, in a lot of ways, dealing with the residual impact of slavery, in the 21st century. And it goes back to this idea of, like, healing. In some cases, it could be thought of as a kind of encouraging a kind of physical return, but it's really more of about an idea of a process of, like, learning what was perhaps lost or concealed, again, from that Sankofa symbol, to go back to the past or history to understand better so that you can move forward into the future. So that idea of the return is really an idea that is in some ways kind of like therapeutic or therapy, if you could use that word. And it's an idea of, the process of learning, understanding, healing, moving forward, and being hopefully made whole again. So when I went to Gorée Island in Senegal, in that image, where I was standing at the Door of Return, what I did was, which is what people don't usually do, but people usually do is they go through this place, the House of Slaves, and then this Door of No Return, they kind of go through to people tell the story that they experienced. They felt like they were being taken away when they went through that experience. When the people that were enslaved and kept there went through that experience, they almost kind of feel that sadness, that energy. When I went there, I purposefully went around from the water side, from the ocean side where the rocks were, and kind of climbed through and came through the other way. Sort of like, for me, it was like the idea is like, okay, ancestrally, someone was taken away, but, we can come back, and you know what I mean? So I think that for me, that's how I approach this idea also of the return. That it can be in some instances a physical return, but we don't necessarily know where we came from. You can't pinpoint it exactly, but I think it's more kind of like an emotional, psychological opportunity to transform and heal through that experience. So I wanted to kind of like replicate that opportunity outside for those who aren't able to actually go back to, say, to Africa or wherever they might have come from ancestrally. I wanted to recreate that opportunity in New York, at the burial ground site, and also at the site for the transatlantic slave trade at the Plaza at the United Nations, as a kind of like an opportunity for people to experience that transition, that passage, and the opportunity for the healing to take place. And that's what really the return is about.
There we go. We have time for 2 questions, and we'll take them both, and then we'll go ahead and answer them. We'll do 3 questions there, and then these two questions here. Just wait for the microphone.
Oh, thank you. My name is Clarissa. I'll be 90 years old in August, and I remember when I was a child growing up, my great-grandmother had come from Guinea as an enslaved person, and along with her cousins. She had a chance to actually grow past, in a respect, the tragedy of being enslaved, but she always wanted to return home. She lived to be 102, but she never had the opportunity to return home. But she was a very gentle and very soft person, and we as children loved to gather around her and just to hear her stories. She's buried now in a small town called Belleville, Texas, where we grew up as children. But it was a wonderful experience just to know that she lived, and she had this horrific experience being separated from her parents as children, to make that journey across the Atlantic Ocean, to be enslaved, to be sold to others, to be abused sexually, to have children that were part European because of the abuse. And yet she survived that tragedy and lived as a complete person for 102 years.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful.
Hi, my name is Rashid, and I'm a fan of Clarissa here since we're at Laney College. And I have 2 questions. So first, a few years ago, I was able to go to New Orleans, and I saw, while it was still there, the Robert E. Lee statue that was there. And I don't know if this is true or accurate, but someone said that the monument faced north because you never turn your back on the Yankee. And it was some idea of, this resistance to the North. And so, again, I didn't see it written anywhere. And so my first question is about any hidden meanings in public art, and what's maybe the value, and if you've done any of that you could share in company here. Maybe not everybody, maybe just me and Professor Rayford later. But just that hidden meaning in statues. And then the second is just if you had any thoughts about the removal of these statues and monuments that we're seeing throughout the country.
And let's just take that last question up. We'll take that last question right there, and then you can answer all of them together. Okay. Thanks.
My name's Tony Platt. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we have a lot to learn from you here in California and here at the university. I don't know of another memorial other than the African Burial Memorial in New York that does the combination of things that you do there. It respects science. The archaeologists were brought in to look at the human remains. It respects education. You didn't show a slide here of the educational part, but it's a very important part of the memorial. You have ceremonies, you have rituals, you have participation. I don't know of any other place, any other memorial in the United States that does that. You'll find places like that, of course, in Germany and other countries, but not here in the United States. Here in California, our slavery has a lot to do with the history of Native people in California, the genocide that took place in the 19th century, the enslavement that took place after the genocide for the survivors of genocide. And then on top of that, the looting and stealing of human remains and funerary objects from graves that took place all over California. And here in this university provided the leadership in the looting of graves, taking some originally 10,000 human remains that are kept on campus. There are about 9,000 here. I don't know if today, when you got your tour of the campus, that this was pointed out to you, the place where those remains are. But this is sort of the long-standing, well-known dirty secret of the university, and it's something that I think this university has to come to terms with and has to learn from the kind of example that you've set. And then that was an observation. And just a quick question, because from what I understand in what happened in New York is that there was tremendous political activism around the site, and that this is a very expensive, valuable piece of property that this memorial is on, and there was a lot of interest in developing it for other reasons. So the question is, to what extent do you think that long history of political activism around making the site into what it is today and getting you to be a part of it, how much do you think that was responsible for the outcome and the results that we have? And is that a model then for those of us here in California trying to get this university to respect its tragic past?
Thank you. So,
Thank you for those questions.
got 'em all?
I guess I'll start with
Okay.
Rashid. I mean, in regards to symbolism, I guess you were asking about. A lot of what it is that what I do is really kind of symbolic. It's laden with like a lot of symbolism and meaning, and I think that memorials, they occupy kind of like a space between, let's say, traditional art and sculpture and architecture. So, their role is not to give you kind of like a literal interpretation. But at the same time, it's not meant to be completely an abstraction, right? There's information there, and the question is like, and there's an important part of history that's somehow there within that space itself and within the objects themselves. The question is like, how does one begin to allow people to feel that importance and engage in the experience so that they can take with them the meaning and the power behind what's being memorialized. And we try to do it in a way that's more spatial as opposed to formal, even though the work is also very formal. But I think when you're doing these kinds of things that are formal without space, then people don't have the same level of kind of like experience. And you see like these different elements, there's always kind of like an underlying meaning through it. So when we were presenting today, we were trying to give you a sense of like what some of the meaning behind a lot of these forms are. Because most people, when they come to the site, let's say like the burial ground, they'll notice like, the reinterment zone and the mound. So they'll intuitively maybe lay wreaths or flowers or other objects there on those mounds because they have a symbolic relationship to burial mounds at cemeteries, right? Or other types of larger burial mounds. And, there was that slide of the Shinto shrine participants who came to the libation court, and they didn't provide libations, but they did something which is kind of very interesting, which I guess, Asian cultures as well as African cultures and other cultures do, which is place these kind of like food and offerings in the center of the court, and then essentially go to four corners and make their ritualistic homage to their ancestral spirits. So these are things that in a lot of ways transcend, let's say, even libation itself transcends, let's say, the experience of African people. It happens in Europe, Asia, and other places. So we were trying to create symbolism that ties back to the meaning of the site specifically, but also kind of like, I think, universal symbolisms. And, when you go to the site, there's no place that's really kind of explaining all this kind of stuff to you. Like, you don't know, like, why there's seven, elements or why, there are seven mounds, but somehow that there's something that lies beneath this that's significant. So yes, symbolism plays a role, and, in this presentation today, we're able to kind of explain some of that symbolism, but there's also other things that we can kind of, if we have time, we can kind of talk about also in terms of like the cosmology behind how the spaces were conceived and three-dimensionalized, and how that relates to Congolese cosmology, and also how that translates to kind of like more diaspora and spiritual beliefs practices that's three-dimensionalized. So that there's more to it than that. In regards to the Confederate monuments, and the idea of taking monuments down. Interesting enough, this is something that's happening. Obviously, more and more people are claiming public space and history and their role in history much more recently in the last couple of years than I think that I've remembered for a very long time. So even in New York City, there was like this monument commission that was set up by Mayor de Blasio a couple of years ago for them to assess even the monuments throughout the whole city and to make recommendations of, what should be done for certain monuments that may or may not be appropriate in the 21st century, and how do we address that. There was one monument of I think it was a well known gynecologist who.
Marion Sims.
Could you
J. Marion Sims.
Yeah, who I believe it was recently, because he experimented on a lot of women of color without anesthesia, and to do like a lot of basically tortured women. So that was taken down. So I think that there needs to be a process which is very local, with people that and communities that are impacted by these monuments and the histories that they represent, because obviously they were not inclusive and not representative of where we want to be moving forward into the future. And that goes towards the last question of the activism aspect. And in the case of the burial ground, activism played a critical and a pivotal role. New York City's activist community at the time that the burial ground was uncovered was very powerful. At the time, we had David Dinkins as a black mayor. We also had very strong community organizations and historical organizations. And we also had representation in Congress that was very strong. So they were able to not only halt the construction, but they were able to make sure that the federal government had made three promises. One, that the site was going to be National Historic Landmark, there was going to be like a memorial, and there was going to be a museum, which ended up being kind of like an interpretive center, but there's still potentially a museum, congressional legislation for that. But all of this was possible because of people's activism, and that kind of like shedding a light on that history and shedding a light on that space and that place allowed, what people would consider to be virtually impossible. Like, this site is now a national monument, right behind City Hall in the middle of Lower Manhattan. And not only that, what people don't even understand is that site on Duane Street, because of where it's located between Broadway and Foley Square, is the most secure site in all of New York City. It makes 9/11 Memorial, Lower Manhattan site, look like kindergarten. You can't drive down Duane Street without, the streets are blocked off without having like a background check, like days before. All the streets have federal guards in them because the buildings there hold some of the most sensitive information and material that our federal government has to control and protect. So just to be able to get to do that, there is also kind of like another level of like, wow, this actually really was able to happen. So it shows the power of like activism to actually do that. And this was like not too many years after 9/11. People were like super paranoid. And you could only imagine I had to have like hundreds of contractors with their background checks just to get materials delivered back and forth to that site. The logistics of that were just like a nightmare. And you can imagine having to get like hundreds of people like on a daily basis through like airport screening just to build this thing. And we connected back to the building for all of our utilities and resources. So I had to basically dig down, break through the sub-level cellars, and I had to get access to like all their, mechanical and electrical rooms. FBI, everybody didn't want anything to do with that. You know what I mean? So it was like a lot. So that site and us being able to do that, it just shows, if you really have a very strong, politically motivated constituency, you can almost do like anything, honestly. Yeah.
That's a great place to end. Thank you very much, Rodney Leon. And thank you all for coming. We hope to see many of you back on March 5th.